Max at Map Action. Paul, Juan, welcome. Are you here? Where are you?
I am. Thank you. Can you all hear me?
Right. Yes.
Okay, good.
Yes.
I have a presentation, so before I actually start talking, let me just make sure that I can get this presentation going. Um, just a minute. And can you confirm that you can see that? I'm sorry.
We also have sound.
Okay, good. Right. So let me see. So if you can see the presentation, my name is Juan Duarte. I'm the technical director for Map Action. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's been really interesting to hear the areas of work and the updates that you have been providing, and the fascinating presentations. I am very interested in the tech side of things. So even though I am speaking for Map Action, I am not a GIS person. So let me say that first. I don't do geospatial, I do technology, which actually means that I do very little of the data science. What I want to do is to enable it and to make sure that Map Action is able to make use of not only data science, but data in general. And that's my mission at Map Action. So the presentation that I'll do was originally done with my colleague Hannah Kerr, which is she's our data scientist. And I wish she could have joined me for this one, but I thought that I would use this presentation because not only does it provide a quick introduction, a rather thorough introduction to Map Action and what we have been doing and what we're intending to do in the future, but it also allows me to give you a clear focus on data, which I thought was relevant for the group. So what will I cover? I want you to know a bit more about Map Action and its role in the sector. I would like to tell you a bit about what we're doing with regards to data science, but mainly I would like to show you why we think this is relevant and how through technology and through the use of data, we believe that we can improve our impact in the sector. And I also want to share some key challenges with you that we have, because perhaps you can help, and would love it if you could help us. So having said that, quick introduction to Map Action. Map Action was started in 2002. Map Action is mainly about people. We are a volunteer membership organization made up of over 86 volunteers at the moment, and we're always recruiting. We aim to maintain a team that is available not only to deploy to emergencies rather quickly. We are first responders, but we're also skilled in a number of areas that allows us to work proactively and allow us to work without being in the context of an emergency. So you can see in that slide the team. That's actually quite an old one, and it doesn't have our latest batches of volunteers. We are currently running a volunteer recruitment process, which is culminating around October, when we will appoint a new cadre of about 6 volunteers. And I'm glad to say that two of the roles, we're advertising for 3 roles. 2 of them are tech related. One of them is software development, and the other one is a data engineer role. So not GIS, but actually supporting this new way of working at Map Action that is heavily reliant on data. We are predominantly based in the UK, but especially over the last couple of years, we spread around the world. Now we have staff in Canada and New Zealand and Europe, and there are volunteers scattered throughout Europe and in some other places around the world. And so we are a global team. We're increasingly becoming a global team, and that works globally. Although most of our training, capability building, and the staff are mostly do reside in the UK. We have done a number of missions that is actually out of date. It is always out of date, no matter what we do with this slide. We work on these missions in different contexts. Sometimes it's a natural hazard. Sometimes it's a complex emergency that it can be a protracted emergency. It can be a very slow onset emergency. But no matter which type of emergency, we're always intending to respond to the needs of those that are affected by these emergencies. We do so working through our volunteers, but also in collaboration with others. So you can see here one of our Map Action volunteers working with the UN. We have a long-standing relationship with UNDEC, who respond to emergencies within the UN. And we have a number of memorandums of understanding, partnerships with regional organizations around the world, namely CIRIMA in the Caribbean, which covers most of the Caribbean, AHA in the Pacific and Asia, CSDRR also in Asia. And we're intending to increase the number of partnerships so that we can work proactively with these organizations. And when it comes to working reactively, responding to an emergency, we have agreements and we have working relationships that allow us to respond quicker and more effectively. Unsurprisingly, as the name says, we do maps. We actually do a lot of maps, and it's a blessing and a curse because people do know us for our maps, but we don't not only do maps. Most of the work that we do actually does not involve a map. And it won't surprise you that a lot of the work to create a map is data work. So we spend about 80% of our time, if not more, sometimes it's 95% of our time, on doing data preparation so that you can put those insights on the map. But there's a lot of data work, and our volunteers and our staff are very familiar with the challenges and the requirements of data work to enable mapping. We do quite a few different types of maps depending on the circumstances and the partner that we're working with. There's always a set of maps that we're calling here core maps that we make. Those vary from about 7 to 9 depending on how you count them and depending on whether you're counting situational maps. But there's at least 7 that we can do regardless of any situation, and that, quite importantly for me, we can do in preparedness. So we don't have to wait for an emergency to have those maps, and more importantly, to have the data ready to create maps for a given location or a given region. And this leads me to the main point that I'm after over the last perhaps year and a half, if not 2 years at Map Action, which is this transformation of going from a reactive organization to a very proactive organization, based mostly around our attitude, our workflows with regards to data. So we are looking very, very intently at this first statement. How do we focus more on data rather than mapping? Because everyone acknowledges that there's a lot of data work, that 80% of their time might be working on the data, but we still think as if we're just making maps. And there's a shift to be made in not only the mentality, not only in the workflows individually for every mapper, but also in the capability of the organization. So we used to only recruit GIS experts, and we were full of GIS experts. And then you realize, actually, a lot of the work that we're doing doesn't even require GIS. It may need more insights from the data side and from the technology side, making sure that we have the right infrastructure. So in making this shift, a key acknowledgement, and my approach in describing this to you is rather different than when we have done this presentation before, but you, I think, understand better than any other group how data actually needs to be catered for. All the preparation that needs to be made in terms of the technology, the foundation in terms of technology, of the capability, the training, and some roles, increasingly at Map Action, are going to be not GIS roles. They're going to be enabling GIS, and they're going to be focused on data. One such role is the role of the data scientist. It's a year and a half since we hired our first staff data scientist. And we started data science not from the data science perspective, but from the requirements of data science, informing how we needed to approach things differently. So how we, in terms of our technology stack and the roles and our workflows and the kinds of products that we could create, so how that would inform what we need to do in the future. After a year and a half, this role is now becoming fully operational. And when we make that distinction, there are roles like mine that are not operational. We're enabling roles. We support our operations department. Operations are who run our projects, and they do the missions, and they fly away, and they go to the Caribbean. Unfortunately, when there's a hurricane, so they can't go to the beach. And we're also thinking about automation a lot. So how can we make sure that, because we have 80% of the work all the time in front of us, how can we automate everything that can be automated so that we can focus on the key aspects that we really need to engage with? So if it's automated and the computer can do it, let the computer do it. So that's a mantra that we're trying to get people to think about all the time. Our volunteers are very dedicated, and when they see a task, they'll just engage with the task. The way I'm trying to get them to see the problem is that they shouldn't really, that we should have a way of offloading that to some ETL process, and then they can engage with thinking about the map. So in that regard, I like the way many of you were presenting about the role of the analyst. Our GIS volunteers are actually analysts. They understand the problem, they understand the requirements, they understand the impact that they can have. And sometimes they need to convince somebody that, if only they considered this, we can have a better impact, we can get something done quicker, and therefore in an emergency, this matters a lot. So what is data science in particular? And I warn you, the next set of slides are the ones that Hannah would have done. So she would have done a much better job. But let me tell you a little bit. So what does putting data before the map mean to us? It means that MapAction really has to shift its thinking. We still do maps. We still are all about the insights that we put in the map, but we need to make that shift. Because even though a map might be very simple, like this one, note this is an automatically produced map already, based on our recent automation efforts. It is based on a highly curated set of data sets, and it uses one of our simplified templates. So this is something important that a lot of people don't notice. We actually take away most stuff from regular mapping. So we focus people on what really matters. And most of our maps actually look a lot simpler, and maybe they don't look very sophisticated, but there's a lot of thinking behind that. Some of our maps, one of our volunteers refers to them as naked maps. They're just black and white lines, and they're designed so that people can draw them. And simplifying them is actually the trick. So what you see here is actually, as you could guess, based on a lot of data. There are 22 data sets that go into a country overview map, which is that one. And those 22 data sets require ETL. They require finding the data somewhere, finding the reliable source of data that needs to be transformed in a particular way and loaded onto our standard directory structure, because we enable remote offline mapping as well. So we can't have services that are online, and our volunteers rely on a structure that uses a naming convention and allows them to run a mission potentially entirely offline for the duration of the mission, and just on the basis of a directory structure with the right source of data. So what happens then is we use that data to layer constantly on these foundational core maps. We're always layering everything else that we come to understand about the situation. So the base map, those core maps are current focus. We know that those core maps are going to be used because they represent this base layer on which we build everything else. So if we already have a fully curated map of a given location, then we engage with just the situational. We don't worry about getting that map perfect. It is already taken care of, and we can engage with who is there, what are they doing. We can essentially do what we call 3-4W mapping: who, what, where, what are they trying to achieve, how can we engage with them to better support their work. We use a number of data sets. In particular, I'd like to highlight OSM, the OpenStreetMap database, which is to us like the Wikipedia of maps. And we use quite a few of its aspects. So things like roads, rivers, lakes, buildings, hospitals, settlements. It is one source for that. It is not our only source for that. A lot of the time, even though OSM is updated and hot, our colleagues in the sector do a great job in ramping up and getting things updated as an emergency happens, we still rely on other sources of information. Some areas of the world, surprisingly, remain unmapped, and we have had to run missions in them. We use a lot of satellite data, and we do engage in remote sensing analysis. We use population data. Most of the time, we're interested in how an emergency is impacting the population in the location. And so population density, for example, exemplified here in this data set, which is from WorldPop, it helps us make sense of who is affected. What's the combination of the extent of the event and the extent of population? Where are those overlaps? Or in preparedness, we can figure out things like vulnerability, potential vulnerability given expected types of emergencies. So the other important point here is, and this is looking at things from rather the data scientist perspective, which is Hannah's perspective here, it's trends over time. A lot of the time, a map is just a snapshot in time. But increasingly, things that are not maps require trend analysis, for example, or time series analysis, so that you can figure out something like this. And what you're looking at is actually the price of corn in Malawi over the last 20 years. Sometimes analysis like that, or recent other examples like being able to predict locust swarms in Eastern Africa, which we engaged in very recently over the last 6 months, actually, and there were 2 of those. So that requires analyzing data over time, and sometimes this is quite a bit of data, actually. So humanitarian data in general, it looks very similar to the data that you work with. We don't work with big data, not yet, at least. Sorry. And it looks like, as I say, your data. It is mostly spatial in nature because that's our expertise. It does have temporal dimensions. We're interested in what was there, what there is now, and perhaps when working in preparedness, what could happen if we're aiming to do simulations. It comes from many sources. We deal with things like OSM, but also the Humanitarian Data Exchange, with local authorities. We do remote sensing. We have many agreements with companies that provide us with data on an ad hoc basis, but also on a regular basis, and we need to work with data constantly. It may be, as Hannah tends to point out, it may be too large to think of in the traditional map action way of a single lone mapper working with a directory. And this is perhaps one of the growth areas for us. And rather importantly, it is of variable quality. And sometimes that means very poor quality. And a lot of the time that means that the quality aspect is that it's just unavailable. And this is actually my bit, the foundation for tech. So this is what, as the technical director, I'm trying to achieve at MapAction. And let me start with the end in mind. This is our model, the way that we're representing things so that we can explain it to most people. So this is in no way a technically accurate representation, but it does combine the technical and the intent. We are driven by our impact. So the impact that we aim to have, the people that we want to help, our partners, the beneficiaries, population, the affected population, however you want to call it, that is our motivation. And so we start there. We start with the people. Understanding the requirements, we then develop a product that tends to be a map. Increasingly, it is a combination of a map and something else. So as we dive into analysis, a lot of the time it's better to represent something as other than a map to be better understood. But so we're aiming to use design principles to engage with our partners and the people that we aim to help. And then we backtrack, and we are right there in the first 2 columns here in the data component. And it is significant that there are 2 out of 3 columns related to data, because as we come to understand what our requirement is, one of the things that we want to do is to consistently apply an approach. And once we learn something, we want to replicate that to other locations, especially when we're working in collaboration with regional entities. When we understand something about one country, we want to replicate that and make sure that everyone else in that region benefits. So we are aiming to implement, and this is not something that we have succeeded at yet, but we need to implement a mechanism for data acquisition that is manageable and that is accessible to our volunteers. So this is a collaborative approach to managing perhaps a data lake, perhaps a data warehouse, perhaps now that I know about lake houses, we need to consider that. But this is to enable visualization and analysis. And one of the key things that we do here is we figure out the qualitative aspects that need to be improved, because our volunteers actually do a lot of work in identifying these points and helping resolve them, because we are working with those that can resolve them, meaning people in country that are supposed to be collecting these data sets. We can help them figure out how to better do that and how to fill these data gaps. Now, we do that, keep in mind these things that we call our mantras, and I'll focus on just the first two. I've already said we automate the repetitive so that we can focus on the unique, and we focus on the data, not on map creation. So my team, the tech team, is taking this approach in an organization that has traditionally always focused on the map and seen data as secondary. We're flipping that and saying, no, focus on the data. The map we know about, the map we can create, it's about 5% of the effort if you already have a template just to feed it with the right data. But getting to the right data is the trick. So that's the approach that we're taking. What it looks so far from a rather high level perspective, as of this year, we are using Airflow, and we have DAGs running to acquire and transform data in a particular way, given a few recipes. And we are using our volunteers who do this process, which they call the data scramble. And it is what it sounds like. They scramble for data last minute to meet the demands of an emergency. We took that concept and we said, all right, let's do data scrambles, but let's not scramble for data. We'll do it slowly. We'll do it in advance. We'll do it in preparation. And then we are currently manually selecting data based on quality markers. We want to change that so that increasingly the data selection process relies on other means of verification that are automated. And we want to do this because we want to find flaws at scale. We want to find data gaps at scale. We want to be able to say, okay, let's analyze a whole continent and find the things that wouldn't meet the demands of our products. And this is a particularly important point. We understand the framing of the data, meaning we understand what we need because we know what it is intended for. Unlike other people that have data, NASA, for example, was doing a presentation in a humanitarian setting, and there was a lady saying, we have lots of data, just use it. It is very nice, but unless you know how you're going to use the data, just availability of data isn't enough. Knowing how we need to use the data, knowing the requirements, knowing the intended use, provides that framing that enables us to say, do we have sufficient data of sufficient quality? Does it really address the need? So right now, we are at a point in which our automation tool, which we call MapChef, is able to produce maps like this one, which is of Malawi again. And we also make other maps based on these very few maps that we're currently able to automate. And we build on those maps made by MapChef, and we're still creating some maps by hand. We need to make sure that we are able to process more data sets so that we enable the creation of more of these maps automatically. What happens so far looks like this. We selected late last year a set of 20 priority countries, and we have 22 data sets for those 22 priority countries. And we were running this process iteratively until all of those issues that are highlighted here in the dashboard that we created to keep track of things, our automation tools were able to determine where we had gaps, where we were failing entirely, where there were some just warnings, issues, and all of those were added to our tasking system. An example of that is here. Our automation tool is able to describe the problem and is able to give our volunteers an indication of what that problem might be and possible solutions. So it's up to the volunteer to grab a task and say, okay, I'll analyze this. And once they figure it out, they submit a fix. And if it passes, then this doesn't happen again. It is resolved. And we get to this point in which we are right now, which is that we currently have 20 countries that were deemed as our priority countries. And this is supposed to be a moving, increasing target. So not only in number of countries, but in number of data sets for each country, so as to enable more mapping of different kinds. Another important aspect that we're working on is data quality, and we're doing that with the Heidelberg Institute for Geoinformation Technology, HIGIT short. They have a tool they call Awesome, and it is awesome. They use the OSM data, therefore the name, and they use the historical OSM database to figure out qualitative aspects of a given area. What we are adding here is, as I was explaining, we look at an area and we say, are we able to make X kind of map for an intended humanitarian purpose? So do we have enough information, for example, on what we consider critical humanitarian infrastructure? And through the Awesome quality analysis tool and the framing of our products, we're able to determine if we have sufficient data of sufficient quality in a given region anywhere in the world. This is in its infancy, but I see a lot of potential here. We have always wanted to explore the issue of data quality as part of our automation and as part of our focus on data. And this is one such avenue. We need to look for more, because OSM is not our only source of data, but it is already allowing us to see things from a data quality perspective. And I'm looking forward to the work after this. In the end, what we're aiming to do is to make our work available to anyone. We have our map and data repository, which you can see here. It is found at maps.mapaction.org. We recently added a different view. Normally we had events, but now what you're looking at is locations. So when in our minds we were only reacting and creating maps for something that happened, it made sense to have an event-based repository. So people that are engaged in that situation at the time could go and get our maps. Increasingly, we want a proactive approach. And therefore, it makes sense to say, okay, let's publish on the basis of either regions or countries. So preemptively, we have already created that view. And the intention is to publish two things, or two types of packages. One is actual maps that anyone can use, and the other is what we're calling sources. And there's another way of looking at this. It might be a package. One of our colleagues came up with the term humanitarian data package, and it's a geo package which contains information in a certain kind, useful for the products that we make. So that is where we want to get to. And based on this foundation that we're building, what we want to provide is actionable insights to everyone engaged in the humanitarian sector in a given location. So to do that, we have been working also with OCHA. My colleague Hannah is actually part-time working seconded to OCHA, and we're working with the predictive analytics team. So this is a team focused on, again, on data and using a lot of data science for their objectives. A couple of examples, perhaps, from the work. This one wasn't done with OCHA, but it was done as part of our new kind of product. It's a very simple one, but don't let the simplicity take away from its impact. It has actually been quite impactful. This was done with an organization called Insecurity Insights, and you can see the URL down there. What it is highlighting is vulnerability for humanitarian actors around the world. And there are reports that they collect and are being mapped and analyzed. And once we engaged with them, we understood that what they needed was actually, rather than just a few maps, we created a web application. And this is now in its third iteration. What you're looking at is perhaps version 1 or version 2. It has been expanded, and now it covers other types of events, not just security threats, but there's another version of this that covers work on COVID from the security perspective. We also are engaged in the COVID response, as I suppose most humanitarian organizations are, but we are working with the COVAX initiative. And this is a very simplistic map. Actually, the work with COVAX is rather different. We're looking on preparedness and helping coordinate the distribution of vaccines in third world countries. But it is one of those key challenges that we were facing over the last 6 months or so. There are examples of the work. This was done by my colleague Hannah again, and it's on flooding in Bangladesh, where we used historical data for flooding to do geospatial analysis again on the topic of flooding, but with looking for predictive opportunities rather than just analysis of the past. I'm sorry, I'm quite aware of the time, so I'm somewhat rushing through things. Do stop me if you'd like me to dedicate a bit more time. Again, something of this new kind of product that we're doing more through data and analysis, predicting drought-related food insecurity. This was done with the team from OCHA for Ethiopia. So we helped them. It was a collaboration, so we helped them with the geospatial aspects and figuring out data sources that could actually address the requirement they had. And in the end, a report was produced. And finally, what challenges are we facing? And as I said, perhaps some of you might find this interesting, and perhaps you can contribute to it. I'd love for that to happen. So, complex problems. What do we mean? We used to live in a very easy world when it came to responding to emergencies. We just created maps. So 15, 20 years ago, almost, it was fairly easy. You created some basic mapping and there was nothing else. Increasingly, we are tackling ever more complex problems in the sector. And this is due to an ability in the sector to tackle them. So we are seeing data capability, GIS capability, an increased use of technology in the humanitarian sector. And that's a great thing. But it means that the problems that we're tackling now are far more complex. The problem of data quality is ever present. And I suppose that to you, that is a very familiar territory. For us in the humanitarian sector, because we weren't so engaged with data work, sometimes it's a surprise. And sometimes it surprises even those people expecting problems. The fact that there was a very recent response in Guyana and Suriname because there was flooding, we could only help Guyana because Suriname was so data poor that we just couldn't. There was no way that we could effectively create even the most basic of maps with the data available for Suriname. So data gaps and data quality issues are still pervasive. And what we think we can do is help identify them. We can't always resolve them, but we can at least identify them quicker and highlight them to the right authorities and work with them and collaborate to make sure that they are addressed. Even the most basic available data would have been great for Suriname. Having figured out that there wasn't a basic set of boundary data, for example, an up-to-date set of boundary data, that would have been nice before the emergency. So going from data-driven insights to data-supported action is an important one for us. there's a lot of talk in the sector about anticipatory action and working mainly in preparedness, and that makes perfect sense. By the time you have to respond to something, it might already be too late. So if we can work on prevention, and if we can work on at least early triggers for some action, then the impact can be increased enormously. So we're definitely committed to becoming less of a reactive organization and much more of a proactive organization based on our data capability. Where to next?
Well, I'm sorry,
sorry?
I'm going to have to sort of cut you short there.
I'm sorry. This is actually my last slide.
Any questions? It's a compromise between questions and
this is actually the last slide, so I can happily stop here and open for questions.
Right.
Thanks, Juan. Has anyone got any questions? By the way, I thought it was a great presentation, amazing cause, and certainly I know that we've got obviously some large organisations on the call today. I'm certainly a bit smaller in that sense, but I would certainly love to look at how we can contribute and help in that kind of sense. So I think it's a well worth cause. But yeah, I'll quickly open for any questions before we move on to our last speaker.
Juan, are you open to taking questions via email if someone comes up and wants to contact?
Of course, I'll type my email. I won't. You should have my email as I joined the call, but I will type my email in the chat window, so you all have it.
That's great. Thank you.
It's lovely. Thank you.